Today, we're learning one of the most useful story building tools in Spanish, the past perfect, or in Spanish, el pluscuamperfecto. Don't worry, the name sounds like a superhero, but the idea is actually simple. The past perfect means had done something. It talks about an action that happened before another past action. So in English, if you say, I ate, that's just past. But if you say, I had eaten, now you're looking further back in time. It's the past before the past. And Spanish builds this in a very friendly way. You use the imperfect of haber plus a past participle. In plain English, había, habías, había, habíamos, habían, plus a word like comido, hablado, vivido, terminado, visto. So the pattern is very stable. Think of it like this. Haber is the time machine and the participle is the action. Put them together and boom, you're in the earlier past. Let's hear the basic forms first. Yo había, I had. Tú habías, you had. Él or ella había, he or she had. Nosotros habíamos, we had. Ellos habían, they had. Notice something nice? 3 forms are exactly había sound family forms, and nosotros has that longer habíamos. If you remember the little rhythm, había, habías, había, habíamos, habían, it starts to stick. Now the second part, the past participle. For regular verbs, it's easy. For our verbs, drop the R and add ado. Hablar becomes hablado, spoken. Terminar becomes terminado, finished. For ER and IR verbs, drop the ending and add ido. Comer becomes comido, eaten. Vivir becomes vivido, lived. So if present tense is lots of moving pieces, the past perfect is actually surprisingly calm. 1 helper verb, 1 participle, done. Let's build one. I had already eaten is yo ya había comido. Notice ya means already. That little word shows up a lot with the past perfect. How do you say I had already eaten in Spanish? Yo ya había comido. Good. Say it once more in your head. Yo ya había comido. Now let's make this practical. Imagine your friend says, why weren't you hungry? You answer, ya había comido. I had already eaten. Very natural, very useful. Let's try another one. She had finished her homework. Is ella había terminado su tarea? Nice and clean. Había plus terminado. How do you say she had finished her homework in Spanish? Ella había terminado su tarea. Excellent. And here's a tiny useful detour. Tarea means homework or assignment. Su tarea can mean her homework, his homework, or your homework in a formal situation. But for this lesson, we'll keep it simple as her homework. Now, when do we use this tense? Usually when telling a story with 2 past moments. For example, cuando llegué, ella ya había salido. When I arrived, she had already left. The arrival happened in the past, but the leaving happened even earlier. So the past perfect sets the background. A memory trick. If your sentence has 2 past events, ask yourself which one happened first. That earlier one often wants the past perfect. For example, llegamos al cine, pero la película ya había empezado. We arrived at the cinema, but the movie had already started. First, the movie started. Then we arrived. So había empezado marks the earlier action. How do you say they had arrived late in Spanish? Ellos habían llegado tarde. Great. Llegado comes from llegar, to arrive. And tarde means late. Short, useful, high-frequency vocabulary. Now let's talk about something learners often do wrong. A very common mistake is mixing up simple past and past perfect. If you say comí, that means I ate. If you say había comido, that means I had eaten. Those are not the same. One is just a past event. The other is an event before another past event. So if you're telling a story and want to create that earlier layer, reach for había plus participle. Another common mistake, trying to change the participle to match gender or number. In this structure, don't do that. You say ella había comido, not ella había comida. The participle stays the same here. Easy win. Let's get more comfortable with the pattern. We had never seen that movie is nosotros nunca habíamos visto esa película. How do you say we had never seen that movie in Spanish? Nosotros nunca habíamos visto esa película. Nice. And visto is one of those very common irregular participles. Ver becomes visto, not verido. Thankfully, Spanish gives us only a handful of common irregulars that matter a lot. Here are a few worth knowing because they appear everywhere. Hacer becomes hecho. Do or make becomes done or made. Ver becomes visto, seen. Decir becomes dicho, said. Escribir becomes escrito, written. Volver becomes vuelto, returned. Abrir becomes abierto, opened. You do not need a giant list today. Just recognize that some common verbs have special participles. Let's hear a few examples. Ya había hecho la comida. I had already made the meal. Él había dicho la verdad. He had told the truth. Nosotros habíamos abierto la ventana. We had opened the window. Quick side note. In everyday Spanish, people often drop subject pronouns because the verb already tells you who. So instead of nosotros habíamos visto esa película, you may simply hear nunca habíamos visto esa película. Totally normal. Now let's turn it into a question. Had you studied before the class? In informal singular Spanish is ¿habías estudiado antes de la clase? How do you say had you studied before the class? ¿Habías estudiado antes de la clase? Perfect. Notice the question is built with voice and question marks, not with a special helper like English does. Spanish just uses the same tense and turns it into a question. Let's do a few more naturally. How do you say he had spoken with Ana in Spanish? Él había hablado con Ana. How do you say I had lived there for 2 years in Spanish? Yo había vivido allí por 2 años. Nice. Tiny note. Allí means there. You may also hear ahí or allá in other contexts, but allí is a nice clear choice. How do you say we had already left in Spanish? Nosotros ya habíamos salido. That one gives us another irregular participle. Salir becomes salido, which is actually regular, so good news there. Not every common verb is irregular. Spanish is kind enough to surprise you less than you fear. Now let's combine the tense with time words, because these help the meaning click. Ya means already. Nunca means never. Antes de means before. Cuando means when. These are great friends of the past perfect. Listen. Yo ya había comido. I had already eaten. Nunca habíamos visto eso. We had never seen that. Habías estudiado antes de la clase. You had studied before class. Cuando llegué, ellos ya habían salido. When I arrived, they had already left. See the pattern? Earlier past action, often with a clue word. One more important point. The past perfect in Spanish uses imperfect haber, not preterite haber. So stick with había, habías, habíamos, habían. If you learn just that frame, you can say a lot. Here's a good shortcut for memory. Think of había as the Spanish sound of had. Not a literal translation trick for every situation, but for this tense, it works beautifully. If your English sentence has had plus past participle, Spanish often has había, habías, había, habíamos, habían plus participle. Let's do a mini story together. Escucha. Ayer fui al restaurante con unos amigos. Yesterday I went to the restaurant with some friends. But when we arrived, el chef ya había preparado la comida. the chef had already prepared the food. I wasn't very hungry, because yo ya había comido un poco en casa. I had already eaten a little at home. My friend Marta was happy because ella había terminado su trabajo temprano. She had finished her work early. And one friend was confused because nunca había probado ese plato. He had never tried that dish. In just a few lines, the tense helps us show what happened before the main moment. How do you say, the chef had already prepared the food in Spanish? El chef ya había preparado la comida. Very good. And yes, chef is commonly used in Spanish too. How do you say, he had never tried that dish in Spanish? Él nunca había probado ese plato. Excellent. Probar means to try or taste. Plato means dish, like a dish of food. Before we finish, let's catch two final traps. First, don't confuse había with había there is. At your level, just listen to the whole sentence. If you hear había plus participle, like había comido, that's past perfect. Second, don't overuse this tense when there's only one past action. If you simply mean I ate, say comí. If you mean I had eaten before something else happened, say había comido. So here's the core idea one last time. Past perfect in Spanish equals imperfect haber plus past participle. Había comido, habías estudiado, había terminado, habíamos visto, habían llegado. Earlier past action. That's the heart of it. Let's recap with a quick rhythm. I had eaten, había comido. You had studied, habías estudiado. She had finished, había terminado. We had seen, habíamos visto. They had arrived, habían llegado. If you can feel that rhythm, you can use this tense. You did great today. This is one of those grammar points that sounds big at first, but the structure is actually very repeatable. And repeatable means learnable. Keep listening for ya había, nunca había, cuando llegué ya había, and soon your ear will start recognizing it automatically. Poco a poco, little by little, you're building real Spanish story power. See, story power. Very official term. Keep going, and I'll see you in the next lesson.